The terminal went silent in a way that felt physical, like the air itself had stopped moving. A man in a $1,000 coat jabbed his finger toward the pilot standing quietly at the gate, his voice rising loud enough to carry across the entire boarding area. "People like you," he sneered, "have no business sitting in that cockpit." Captain Elijah Marshall did not flinch. He stood there in his crisp Navy uniform, for gold stripes on his shoulders, his face calm as still water. Around him, dozens of passengers froze mid-step. Phones rose into the air. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking why the angry man was yelling. Somewhere near the window, a gate agent's hand hovered over a telephone, unsure whether to call security or just keep watching. Nobody in that terminal knew the truth. Nobody understood what was about to unfold. They saw an arrogant rich man humiliating a black pilot in public, and they assumed they understood the whole story. They didn't. Not even close. Because the man shouting, red-faced, furious, certain of his own power, had no idea who he was really speaking to. He had no idea that the calm man in front of him held more authority over that airline, over that gate, over that entire terminal, than anyone watching could imagine. What happened in the next 10 minutes would shatter that arrogant man's world completely. But first, the humiliation had to happen. First, Elijah had to stand there and take it, because the full truth was not ready to come out. Not yet. Elijah Marshall grew up in a small house on the edge of Atlanta, where summer storms rattled the windows and his mother worked double shifts at a diner to keep the lights on. His father had left when Elijah was 7, and from that day forward, it was just the two of them, a tired woman and a boy who stared at airplanes cutting across the sky and dreamed of one day being the person inside them. His mother, Dorothy, never had much. But she had faith in her son, and she poured every bit of it into him. "You're going to fly one day," she used to tell him, tucking him into a bed with a thin blanket. "Don't you ever let anybody tell you that you can't." He held on to those words like a lifeline. Elijah studied harder than anyone in his class. He worked at a gas station after school to save for flight lessons, sitting in a small Cessna with an instructor twice his age who barely believed a 16-year-old kid from the South Side could ever afford to finish the program. But Elijah did finish it. He saved every dollar, skipped meals when he had to, and earned his private pilot's license before he even graduated high school. College brought more obstacles. He was often the only black student in his aviation classes. Professors doubted him. Classmates whispered that he had been let in only because of a scholarship program, not because he had earned it. He heard the comments. He let them roll off his back, the way his mother taught him. "Let your work speak," she always said. "Let your work speak louder than their mouths." And it did. By the time Elijah was 30, he had flown for 2 regional airlines, accumulated thousands of flight hours, and built a reputation as one of the calmest, most precise pilots in the industry. Captains spoke of him with respect. Air traffic controllers recognized his voice on the radio. He had landed planes through storms that grounded other pilots, guided passengers through turbulence with a steady voice that made people feel safe even when the plane was shaking. But none of that ever stopped people from doubting him the moment they saw his face before they saw his uniform. He had been mistaken for a baggage handler more times than he could count. He had been asked, while standing at the cockpit door in full captain's uniform, whether the real pilot was nearby. He had endured passengers double-checking his credentials, asking him questions they would never ask a white pilot, scanning his badge like it might be fake. Elijah had built a wall around himself, not bitterness, but quiet endurance. He simply didn't let it touch him anymore. Or so he believed. But on this particular morning, standing at gate 14 waiting to board his flight as a deadheading passenger before taking command of another aircraft 2 cities over, something was about to test that wall like never before. But what happened next would shake him more than anything that came before. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of a Monday morning. Suitcases rattled across tile floors. A toddler cried somewhere near the coffee stand. Announcements echoed overhead, garbled and rushed. Elijah stood near the boarding doors, his small carry-on resting by his feet, his uniform freshly pressed. He wasn't flying this particular leg, he was repositioning to another airport to take command of a different aircraft, but the rules required him to wear his uniform for company travel. He scrolled through messages on his phone, waiting patiently like everyone else. That's when Richard Calloway arrived. Richard moved through the terminal like he owned every square foot of it. Tall, silver-haired, dressed in a tailored coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, he walked with the kind of entitlement that radiated before he even opened his mouth. He had missed his original flight due to traffic, and irritation simmered beneath his expensive cologne. He stormed up to the gate counter, slammed his boarding pass onto the desk, and barked at the gate agent, a young woman named Priya, demanding to know why the flight hadn't already started boarding. "Sir, boarding starts in 10 minutes, Priya said politely. "We're waiting on." "I don't care what you're waiting on," Richard snapped. "Do you know who I am?" Priya's jaw tightened, but she kept her professional composure. "I understand you're frustrated, sir. We'll have you boarded as soon as possible." Richard turned away from the counter, muttering under his breath, his eyes scanning the gate area like he was looking for someone to blame. That's when his gaze landed on Elijah. A black man. In a pilot's uniform. Standing calmly near the boarding doors. Something about Elijah's stillness, his quiet confidence, seemed to provoke Richard even further. Maybe it was the bad morning. Maybe it was years of unchecked privilege finally finding a target. Whatever it was, Richard's frustration turned into something uglier. "You," Richard said, voice already rising. "Are you actually a pilot, or is that just a costume?" Elijah looked up slowly, his expression calm. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Richard said, stepping closer. "I asked if you're actually qualified to fly a plane, or if this airline just hands out uniforms to check a diversity box." The words hit like a slap. A few nearby passengers gasped audibly. Priya's eyes widened from behind the counter. Elijah's chest tightened, old wounds threatening to reopen, but his voice remained steady. "I can assure you, sir, I'm fully qualified." "Qualified," Richard repeated mockingly, loud enough for the entire gate to hear. "People like you shouldn't be allowed anywhere near a cockpit. I've seen guys like you, given a badge, given a uniform, and suddenly everyone's supposed to pretend you belong up there." Gasps rippled through the terminal. A woman covered her mouth in shock. An elderly man shook his head in disbelief. Several people lifted their phones, recording the unfolding scene. Elijah's hands clenched at his sides, but his face remained composed. Years of training, not just as a pilot, but as a man who had survived a lifetime of moments just like this, kept him grounded. "Sir," Elijah said quietly, "I think you should calm down." "Don't tell me to calm down," Richard snapped, his voice cracking with fury. "I've flown 100 times. I know what real pilots look like. And you," he jabbed his finger toward Elijah's chest, "you do not look like one." The terminal had gone fully silent now. Even the announcement seemed to pause. Every eye was locked on the unfolding confrontation, waiting to see what Elijah would do. But nobody in that crowd knew the secret that was about to unravel everything. Elijah stood there, absorbing the verbal assault, feeling the eyes of strangers boring into him from every direction. Humiliation burned in his chest, hot and suffocating. He thought about his mother, about the diner shifts she worked, about the nights she came home with swollen feet just so he could afford flight lessons. He thought about every professor who doubted him, every passenger who questioned his badge, every moment he had swallowed his pride just to keep moving forward. He could feel his pulse hammering in his ears. Every instinct told him to defend himself loudly, to match Richard's volume, to demand respect. But Elijah had learned long ago that anger rarely won battles like this. Calm did. Patience did. Truth, eventually, always did. "Sir," Elijah said again, his voice low but firm, "I don't think you understand what you're doing right now." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Richard shot back, his voice dripping with contempt. I understand that this airline is more concerned with appearances than actual competence. Priya stepped out from behind the counter, her voice trembling slightly. Sir, I need you to lower your voice. This is inappropriate. Stay out of this, Richard snapped at her without even turning his head. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Someone near the back muttered, "This is disgusting." Another voice said, "Someone should call security." But Richard wasn't finished. He turned back to Elijah, his eyes narrowing with disdain. "Tell me something. How does someone like you even become a captain? Who signed off on that?" The words landed like a physical blow. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he refused to give Richard the reaction he was hunting for. "I earned it," Elijah said simply. "The same way every pilot earns it." Richard laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed through the terminal. "Sure you did." At that exact moment, a tall man in a dark suit emerged from a nearby office door marked "Airport Operations," drawn by the commotion. He paused at the edge of the crowd, observing the scene with sharp, calculating eyes. Nobody noticed him yet. Nobody understood why his expression shifted from curiosity to alarm the second he recognized who was standing at the center of the confrontation. Because that man recognized Elijah immediately. And what he knew was about to change everything. But that secret was still buried, for now, the man in the dark suit was named Gregory Whitfield, the airport's regional operations director. He had worked in aviation for over 20 years, attending countless executive meetings, board briefings, and airline leadership summits. He had shaken hands with airline owners, sat across tables from CEOs, and memorized the faces of every major stakeholder connected to the airlines operating through his airport. And he knew exactly who Elijah Marshall was. Gregory's pulse quickened as he watched the scene unfold. He stepped closer, weaving through the gathering crowd, his mind racing. He needed to intervene, not because of company protocol, but because the situation in front of him was about to become a corporate nightmare for reasons nobody in that terminal could possibly understand. He reached the edge of the confrontation just as Richard continued his tirade. "This airline should be ashamed," Richard said loudly, "hiring unqualified people just to look good in some diversity report." "That's enough," Gregory said firmly, stepping into the circle. Richard turned, startled by the interruption. "Excuse me. Who are you?" "Gregory Whitfield. Operations Director for this airport." He flashed his badge briefly. "Sir, I need you to stop speaking to this man immediately." Richard scoffed. "Are you serious? I'm a paying customer. I have every right to express my concerns about the competency of your staff." "You have no idea what you're doing," Gregory said, his voice tight with restrained urgency. "I strongly suggest you stop talking right now." Richard rolled his eyes. "Or what? You'll fire him?" He gestured mockingly toward Elijah. "Trust me, that wouldn't be the worst thing that happened to him today." Gregory's eyes widened in disbelief at the audacity, but he held his composure. "Sir, I am not going to explain myself further. I am asking you, professionally, to stop." Elijah remained silent throughout the exchange, watching Gregory's reaction carefully. He recognized the operations director from prior briefings, though Gregory had no idea that Elijah remembered him just as clearly, or why. Richard, sensing he was somehow losing control of the situation despite holding all the social power in the room, turned back toward Elijah with renewed aggression. "You know what?" Richard said, his voice rising again. "I'm going to make sure this airline hears about this. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of pilots they're putting in their cockpits." The crowd's murmurs grew louder. Someone shouted, "This is racist." Another voice yelled, "Let the pilot speak." Elijah finally raised a hand, signaling for quiet. The crowd, surprisingly, obeyed. "Sir," Elijah said calmly, looking directly into Richard's eyes, "you should be very careful about the things you say in public. Words have consequences." Richard sneered. "Is that a threat?" No, Elijah said. It's a fact. Nobody knew yet just how true that fact was about to become. Within minutes, airport security arrived, summoned by a worried bystander. 2 officers escorted Richard away from the gate to a nearby office for questioning, while passengers buzzed with outrage, some clapping as he was led away, others still filming with their phones. Elijah remained near the gate, his composure intact but his hands slightly trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. Gregory approached him quietly, his expression unreadable. "Captain Marshall," Gregory said softly, "I need to speak with you privately." Elijah nodded, and the 2 men walked toward a quiet corner near the gate's window, away from prying eyes and recording phones. "You recognized me," Elijah said simply. Gregory exhaled. "I did. I sat 2 rows behind you during the board's quarterly briefing last spring." Elijah's expression remained calm, though something flickered behind his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of what was coming. "That man back there," Gregory continued, lowering his voice, "he has no idea who you really are, does he?" "No," Elijah said. "And I'd like to keep it that way for now." Gregory studied him carefully. "Why?" Elijah looked out toward the tarmac, where planes taxied slowly under the gray morning sky. "Because if people only respect power when they're forced to, then their respect was never real to begin with. I want to see how this plays out without that information." Gregory nodded slowly, understanding the weight of those words. Meanwhile, footage of the confrontation had already begun spreading online. Someone had uploaded a video titled, "Rich Passenger Humiliates Black Pilot at Airport," and within an hour, it had thousands of views. Comments flooded in, a mixture of outrage, support, and disbelief. The airline's corporate office noticed almost immediately. By midday, an internal investigation had been launched, not against Elijah, but against the airline's public relations exposure. Executives scrambled to understand the situation, unaware that the pilot at the center of the controversy held a connection to the company that none of them yet realized. What they were about to discover would change the trajectory of everyone involved. By the next morning, the video had gone viral, amassing millions of views. Public outrage exploded across social media. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as yet another example of entitled discrimination caught on camera. Airline executives issued a public statement condemning the passengers' behavior and praising Elijah's composure under pressure. For a brief moment, it seemed like justice had already been served. Richard Calloway, identified publicly through leaked footage and witness statements, faced immediate backlash. His name trended online. Business associates distanced themselves from him. A restaurant he frequented removed his reservation. Comment sections filled with calls for accountability. It looked, for a moment, like the story was over, like the villain had been exposed, and the hero had quietly triumphed simply by remaining composed. Elijah received calls from colleagues, messages of support from fellow pilots, even a brief congratulatory note from airline leadership praising his professionalism. He allowed himself a small breath of relief, believing perhaps the worst had passed. But this was only the surface of something much deeper. Because Richard, humiliated and furious over his public downfall, was not finished. Wealthy men used to control rarely surrender quietly. And what he did next would escalate the situation far beyond a simple viral video. They thought the conflict was over. They were completely wrong. Richard Calloway was not just any wealthy passenger throwing a tantrum at an airport gate. He was a major shareholder in a private equity group that held significant investments across multiple industries, including, unbeknownst to almost everyone in that terminal, partial financial stakes tied indirectly to aviation contracts. Humiliated by the backlash, Richard sought to flip the narrative. He hired a public relations firm and released a statement claiming the video had been edited out of context, insisting he had simply asked legitimate questions about safety standards, not made racially charged accusations. He threatened legal action against several news outlets for defamation. Then, in a move that stunned everyone watching the situation unfold, Richard filed a formal complaint with the airline, claiming Elijah had been aggressive and threatening toward him, demanding an internal investigation into Elijah's conduct as a pilot. The airline, fearful of legal repercussions from a man with deep financial connections, found itself in a difficult position. Executives who had publicly praised Elijah just days earlier now hesitated, worried about potential lawsuits and political pressure from board members who had unknown ties to Richard's business network. Elijah received a call from Human Resources requesting his presence for a formal review. The very company he had served loyally for over a decade was now considering disciplinary action against him, not because he had done anything wrong, but because the wealthy man who humiliated him publicly held enough influence to make the airline nervous. Elijah sat in his small apartment that evening, staring at the formal letter requesting his appearance before a review board. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from a deep, exhausted anger that had been simmering quietly for years. After everything, he whispered to himself, after everything I've done, it still comes down to this. He thought about calling his mother, but he didn't want to worry her. Instead, he sat alone in the dim light of his living room, wrestling with a decision that would determine everything that came next. Because Elijah held a secret. A secret so significant that revealing it would dismantle everything Richard believed about power, status, and who truly held control in that situation. The question was no longer whether Elijah would defend himself. The question was when, and how, he would finally let the truth surface. The real secret had not been revealed. Not yet. 3 years before that fateful morning at the airport, Elijah Marshall had quietly become a majority shareholder of Lansing Air Group, the very holding company that owned the airline he flew for, along with 2 smaller regional carriers. It had started with an inheritance nobody expected. Elijah's estranged father, a man who had abandoned him as a child, passed away with a complicated will that named Elijah as primary beneficiary of substantial investments accumulated over decades, including a controlling stake purchased years earlier in Lansing Air Group during a financial restructuring deal. Elijah had been stunned to discover the inheritance, torn between resentment toward the father who left him and the undeniable weight of what he now possessed. Rather than walk away from his pilot career, the dream his mother had nurtured in him since childhood, Elijah chose to keep his position quiet. He hired trusted financial advisors to manage the shares, maintained a strict separation between his identity as a working captain and his role as a silent majority stakeholder, and continued flying because he loved it, not because he needed the paycheck. Only a handful of board members and senior executives knew the truth. Gregory Whitfield, having attended select briefings as part of airport operations liaison meetings, was one of the few outside the core circle who recognized Elijah from those rare appearances. Elijah had built this secrecy deliberately. He didn't want special treatment. He didn't want colleagues changing how they treated him once they learned his net worth. He wanted to be respected for his skill, his discipline, his years of dedication, not his bank account. But now, sitting in his apartment holding a letter demanding his disciplinary review, Elijah realized the time for silence had ended. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he rarely used, the direct line to Marcus Reyes, the airline CEO. "Elijah?" Marcus answered, surprise evident in his voice. "I wasn't expecting." "Marcus," Elijah interrupted calmly, "I think it's time we had a different kind of conversation." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "About the review board?" Marcus asked carefully. "About everything," Elijah said. "I think it's time the board understood exactly who they're considering disciplining." Another pause, longer this time. Then Marcus's voice, quieter now, almost nervous. "You're talking about?" "Yes," Elijah said simply. "I think it's time." What happened next would shock the entire airline to its core. The disciplinary review was scheduled to take place in a sleek conference room at the airline's headquarters, with 5 board members seated around a polished table, along with the head of human resources and 2 legal representatives. Richard Calloway had insisted on attending personally, eager to watch Elijah face consequences for daring to disrespect him. Richard arrived dressed impeccably, his confidence fully restored, a satisfied smirk playing at the corner of his mouth as he took his seat near the head of the table. Elijah entered the room calmly, dressed not in his pilot's uniform this time, but in a sharp charcoal suit. The shift in appearance caused a flicker of confusion among several board members who had only seen him in uniform before. Captain Marshall, the head of HR, began, clearing her throat nervously, "Thank you for joining us. We're here today to review the incident at the airport and determine." Before we proceed, Marcus Reyes interrupted, standing from his seat at the head of the table, "I think there's something the board needs to understand before this review continues." Richard frowned, sensing an unexpected shift in the room's atmosphere. "What's going on here?" Marcus turned to Elijah. "Captain Marshall, would you like to address the board?" Elijah stood slowly, his eyes steady, his voice calm but resonant with quiet authority. 3 years ago, I inherited a controlling stake in Lansing Air Group. I am the majority shareholder of this airline. Silence crashed over the room like a physical wave. Richard's smirk vanished instantly, his face draining of color. That's not possible." "It's documented," Marcus said firmly, sliding a folder across the table containing verified shareholder records. "Captain Marshall has held majority ownership since the restructuring 3 years ago. He chose to keep his position private while continuing his career as a pilot." The board members exchanged stunned glances. One executive who had previously sided with Richard's complaint now looked physically ill. Richard stammered, attempting to regain composure. This changes nothing. He was still aggressive toward me at the airport. I said nothing aggressive," Elijah interrupted, his voice steady but firm now, carrying the full weight of his authority for the first time. "I stood quietly while you humiliated me in front of dozens of strangers, questioning my competence, mocking my qualifications, suggesting I didn't belong in that uniform because of the color of my skin." The room fell utterly silent. "You called me unqualified," Elijah continued, stepping closer to where Richard sat frozen. "You said people like me shouldn't be allowed near a cockpit. You did this not knowing, or perhaps not caring, that the man you were humiliating built his career through years of discipline and sacrifice that you could never understand." Richard's mouth opened, but no words emerged. "What you didn't know," Elijah said quietly, "is that the airline you accused of incompetence, the pilot you mocked publicly, the company whose reputation you tried to damage, you were speaking to its majority owner the entire time." Gasps rippled through the room. One board member actually covered her mouth in shock. "I think," Marcus said, breaking the heavy silence, "this review is now concluded. And I believe a different conversation needs to begin, regarding Mr. Calloway's continued business relationship with this company." Richard's face had gone pale, his earlier arrogance completely collapsed into stunned disbelief. "You can't," Richard whispered. "You can't do this." "I'm not doing anything," Elijah said calmly. "You did this. Every word, every accusation, every assumption, you built this outcome yourself." The wrongdoer's world was about to collapse completely. News of Richard Calloway's humiliation spread through corporate circles even faster than the original viral video. His business partners, already wary after the public backlash, severed ties once they learned the full truth. Not only had he publicly humiliated a pilot based on racist assumptions, but that pilot turned out to be the majority owner of the very airline Richard had tried to damage through false complaints. Several investment partnerships Richard relied on quietly dissolved. Clients withdrew their accounts. The private equity group he was affiliated with issued a statement distancing itself from his personal conduct, fearful of reputational damage by association. Lansing Air Group's board unanimously voted to terminate any pending business agreements connected to Richard Calloway, removing him entirely from consideration for a proposed aviation contract he had been quietly negotiating before the airport incident. Elijah, meanwhile, made a decision that surprised everyone, including Marcus Reyes. Rather than seeking revenge or public vindication, Elijah requested that the airline use the incident as an opportunity for meaningful change. He proposed implementing mandatory bias training across all customer-facing staff, established a formal reporting system for passengers who experienced discriminatory treatment, and personally funded a scholarship program for young aspiring pilots from underprivileged backgrounds, modeled directly after his own difficult journey into aviation. "I don't want this story to be about punishing one man," Elijah explained during a quiet meeting with Marcus. "I want it to be about making sure the next kid who looks like me doesn't have to fight as hard just to be taken seriously." Marcus nodded, visibly moved. "You could have destroyed him entirely, you know. You had every right to." "I know," Elijah said simply. "But that's not the legacy I want to build." A month later, footage emerged of Elijah speaking at a community aviation program, surrounded by young students eager to learn about flight. Cameras captured a moment far different from the viral confrontation that had first introduced him to the public, this time showing warmth, mentorship, and quiet strength rather than humiliation and conflict. The story that had begun with public shame transformed into something far more powerful, a story of dignity preserved, character revealed, and justice delivered, not through revenge, but through truth and purpose. Nobody expected the story to end this way. But perhaps that was exactly why it mattered so much. Months later, Elijah Marshall stood once again at a boarding gate, dressed in his familiar Navy uniform, preparing for another flight. This time, however, something had changed, not visibly, but internally. The weight he once carried alone, the quiet endurance built from years of unspoken battles, felt lighter now. A young gate agent approached him nervously. "Captain Marshall. I just wanted to say, what happened to you, and what you did afterward, it meant a lot to a lot of people. My little brother wants to be a pilot now. He says if you could do it, he can too." Elijah smiled gently, the kind of smile that carried both exhaustion and hope. "Tell him something for me," he said. "Tell him that the world will sometimes try to tell him he doesn't belong somewhere. But the only voice that truly matters is the one that tells him to keep going anyway." As he boarded the aircraft that day, Elijah glanced briefly at the cockpit door, the same kind of door that had once seemed like an impossible dream to a young boy in Atlanta staring up at the sky. He thought of his mother, of every sacrifice she made, every quiet sacrifice that had carried him to this moment. And as the plane lifted off the runway, climbing steadily into the open sky, Elijah Marshall flew forward, not just as a pilot, not just as an owner, but as proof that dignity, patience, and quiet strength could outlast even the loudest cruelty the world tried to throw at him. Because in the end, the truest victory wasn't proving Richard Calloway wrong. It was proving, once and for all, exactly who Elijah Marshall always was.